Long before a single shot was fired in the North African campaign, there was a stretch of the Sahara that European militaries had simply written off the map as impassable. Soldiers called it, among other things, the Great Sand Sea, an ocean of dunes covering tens of thousands of square miles along the border of Egypt and Libya, some ridges rising hundreds of feet high, the sand so fine and loose that a heavy vehicle could sink to its axles in seconds and never come out again. For the German and Italian forces fighting in North Africa, this brutal interior desert was, for practical purposes, a natural wall. No army moved supplies through it. No serious force patrolled its interior. If the war was going to be fought at all, conventional military logic said it would be fought along the narrow coastal strip, where roads, water, and towns actually existed. British planners looked at that same terrain and reached a very different conclusion. If nobody could cross it, then nobody would be watching it. And if a small enough force could actually learn how to survive a journey of 200 or 300 miles through the worst of it, that force could appear behind the enemy's lines from a direction the enemy had never bothered to defend. This is the story of what it actually took to make that crossing real: the vehicles, the navigation, the water discipline, and the hard-won knowledge that turned impassable desert into a route British raiding parties used, again and again, for the rest of the war. The reason Britain had any idea how to attempt this at all traces back to one officer's peacetime obsession, more than a decade before the war began. Major Ralph Bagnold had spent much of the 1920s and 1930s as a British Army officer stationed in Egypt, using his off-duty time to explore the Libyan Desert with small groups of like-minded enthusiasts, driving modified Model A Fords across terrain that conventional wisdom said no wheeled vehicle could survive. In 1932, Bagnold led what is believed to be the first recorded motorized crossing of the Libyan Desert from east to west, developing along the way a set of techniques, reducing tire pressure to spread a vehicle's weight over soft sand, carrying sand channels to free a bogged truck, driving dunes at specific angles and speeds rather than simply gunning straight up them, that had no real precedent in military doctrine anywhere in the world. He also solved a problem that had defeated earlier desert travelers: reliable navigation in terrain with no roads, no landmarks, and a magnetic compass rendered useless by the metal of the vehicle itself. Bagnold developed a specialized sun compass, mounted on the dashboard, that used the sun's position rather than magnetism to hold a bearing, a device that could be read accurately while a truck was in motion, and one that became, quite simply, the difference between finding a target 70 miles into open desert and disappearing into it. When war broke out in 1940, Bagnold happened to be posted through Egypt en route to another assignment, and he brought this decade of hard-won amateur expertise directly to General Archibald Wavell, then Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East. Bagnold's pitch was simple, and in the context of 1940 military thinking, almost eccentric. Give him a small mobile force, and he would use it to commit what he called piracy on the high desert, striking deep behind Italian lines from a direction no one expected, using terrain no one else believed could be crossed at all. Wavell had no better alternative on offer and gave Bagnold 6 weeks to build the unit from scratch. The result was the Long Range Desert Group, the LRDG, and it was this unit's collected expertise, trucks, navigation, water discipline, and raw survival technique that made every later SAS raid across this terrain possible. Crossing terrain like the Great Sand Sea, the Kalanchio Sand Sea, or the punishing Katara Depression required a vehicle that bore almost no resemblance to standard military transport of the period, and the LRDG rebuilt its trucks from the wheels up to survive it. Standard Chevrolet and Ford 30 hundredweight trucks were stripped of anything not strictly necessary: windshields, doors, even the hood in many cases, both to reduce weight and to improve visibility and cooling in extreme heat. Wider, low-pressure desert tires were fitted to spread a vehicle's weight across soft sand rather than dig straight through it, and crews became expert at judging exactly how much air to bleed from a tire on the fly, depending on whether the terrain ahead was hard gravel or the treacherous fine powder of a genuine sand sea. Sand channels, metal or wooden strips carried on the vehicle and wedged under tires that had lost traction, became standard equipment, alongside shovels for the constant, exhausting work of digging trucks free when even the channels weren't enough. Fuel and water were the other absolute limiting factors, and both were carried in quantities that would have seemed absurd to a conventional army unit. A single long patrol might need to be entirely self-sufficient for 3 weeks and 2,000 miles of travel, hauling its own fuel, water, food, ammunition, and spare parts the entire distance, resupplied only by prepositioned dumps established well in advance or by a slow, careful trickle of supply runs from bases like Siwa Oasis in Egypt or Jalo Oasis on the edge of the Great Sand Sea itself. Bagnold devised an ingenious method of conserving water even under these conditions, running engine overflow pipes into partially filled water cans mounted on the front of each vehicle, so that boiling coolant venting from the radiator would simply condense back into usable water rather than being lost to the desert air. None of this equipment, on its own, made the crossing possible. What made it possible was the accumulated, hardened knowledge of exactly how to use it, knowledge that existed nowhere else in the British Army and had to be learned, in most cases, the hard way. Even with the right trucks and the right supplies, 300 miles of open desert without a single reliable landmark presented a navigational problem that conventional army mapping simply could not solve. LRDG patrols crossing terrain features like the Great Sand Sea, the Kalanchio Sand Sea, or the Ribiana Sand Sea depended almost entirely on dead reckoning, using Bagnold's sun compass by day and celestial navigation by star sightings at night, cross-checked against a speedometer reading and a stopwatch to estimate distance traveled along a given bearing. The job of navigator within any given patrol carried a responsibility that bordered on life or death for every man in the vehicles behind him. A navigational error of only a few degrees, uncorrected over 200 or 300 miles, could put an entire patrol dozens of miles from where it believed itself to be, potentially missing a prepositioned fuel dump entirely, a mistake that, in terrain this remote, could be fatal rather than merely inconvenient. Patrols developed careful cross-checking routines, comparing dead reckoning estimates against occasional recognizable terrain features, a particular dune formation, a rock outcrop, a change in the color or texture of the ground that experienced desert hands learned to read the way a sailor reads currents and stars. The terrain itself varied wildly across a single crossing, and each variation demanded a different driving technique learned only through repetition. Hard, flat gravel plains, known as Sirte, could be crossed at genuine speed. Soft, powdery sand seas demanded constant tire pressure adjustment and careful route finding around the steepest dune faces. Rocky ground could tear tires to shreds within a matter of miles if approached carelessly. A patrol that had not built up the specific, terrain-by-terrain experience to read these transitions correctly, in real time, from the driver's seat, risked losing days to bogged vehicles or ruined tires in a place where neither replacement was readily available. The physical toll of a genuine multi-hundred-mile desert crossing extended well beyond mechanical challenges, and the men who made these journeys had to master their own bodies with the same discipline they applied to their vehicles. Daytime temperatures in the open desert regularly climbed to extremes that made unprotected metal on a vehicle painful to touch, while night brought a temperature swing that could plunge conditions to near freezing within a matter of hours after sunset. Patrol members learned to layer clothing accordingly, wearing garments that seemed absurdly heavy for a desert environment once the sun went down, and stripping to the minimum during the punishing heat of midday travel. Water discipline was treated with a seriousness that bordered on ritual. Rationing was calculated with exacting precision against the specific demands of a given crossing, and there was no meaningful room for error. A patrol that miscalculated its water needs against an unexpectedly long or difficult stretch of terrain had no fallback beyond hopping to reach a resupply point before the consequences became serious. Descriptions of returning patrols from contemporary accounts paint a vivid picture of what this discipline actually looked like in practice. Men returning to base after 3 or 4 weeks in the open desert, unwashed because the water ration simply did not stretch to hygiene, bearded, deeply sunburned, in shirts and shorts worn to rags, carrying themselves, in the words of one wartime writer, with the unmistakable bearing of men who had just crossed something most people would have called impossible. Diet, too, was engineered specifically for the punishing caloric demands of this kind of travel. The LRDG developed a standard daily ration built around roughly 5,000 calories, a figure well above typical military rationing of the period, reflecting a hard-learned understanding of exactly how much energy the human body burned simply surviving a full day of desert travel and vehicle recovery work. A ration so effective that the newly formed SAS adopted it wholesale once the two units began working together. The theory behind all of this preparation was tested for the first time almost immediately after the LRDG was formed, in its very first operation in August and September 1940, a deep reconnaissance and raiding mission that saw patrols, including one led by Bagnold himself, travel a combined distance of roughly 4,000 miles entirely undetected. Scouting Italian positions and striking isolated outposts deep behind what Italian commanders had assumed was secure territory. It was an emphatic proof of concept. Italian forces in Libya had organized their defenses almost entirely around the assumption that any serious attack would come from the coastal direction, where roads and infrastructure made conventional movement possible. An armed patrol appearing instead from deep in the supposedly impassable interior desert exposed a gap in Italian strategic thinking that British commanders would continue to exploit for the rest of the North African campaign. From that first operation onward, the LRDG maintained a continuous presence in the deep desert for essentially the remainder of the campaign, running patrols that frequently covered well over 2,000 miles round trip, and on occasion, considerably more, figures in the range of 3,500 to over 4,000 miles for a single extended patrol were not unheard of. A typical patrol, roughly 40 men across 10 vehicles, would spend up to 3 weeks at a stretch operating deep inside enemy-controlled territory, watching roads, gathering intelligence, and when the LRDG's later partnership with the Special Air Service began, delivering raiding parties to targets that would otherwise have been entirely unreachable. When David Stirling's newly formed SAS abandoned parachute insertion for its raids after the disastrous failure of Operation Squatter in November 1941, it was the LRDG's accumulated mastery of exactly this kind of long desert crossing that made the unit's subsequent success possible at all. SAS raiding parties depended on LRDG patrols to drive them, often well over 200 miles across open desert, to strike Axis airfields along the Libyan coast, Sirte, Agheila, Wadi Tamet, Agedabia, and dozens of others over the following months, approaching from directions the German and Italian defenders considered essentially safe from serious attack, precisely because the terrain in between appeared, on paper, to make any such approach impossible. Stirling himself later summarized the scale of what this partnership achieved with striking simplicity, noting that by mid-1942, his unit had struck virtually every significant German and Italian airfield within roughly 300 miles of the front at least once, in some cases repeatedly, a campaign that by his own accounting destroyed 143 enemy aircraft in the first 6 months of that year alone. None of it would have been possible without the specific, hard-won expertise this chapter has traced, the vehicles stripped down and adapted for sand rather than road, the sun compass and dead reckoning navigation that replaced maps that simply didn't exist for this terrain, the water and fuel discipline that kept small patrols alive and self-sufficient for weeks at a time, and the accumulated terrain-by-terrain driving knowledge that let experienced crews read the difference between gravel, dune, and rocket speed in real time, hundreds of miles from any hope of rescue if they got it wrong. It is tempting, in telling stories of raids and firefights, to treat the journey to a target as mere transportation, the boring part before the real action begins. The men who actually made these 300-mile crossings would have found that framing almost absurd. The desert itself was, in a very real sense, the primary adversary of every operation launched across it. It could bog a truck permanently within seconds of a single misjudged dune approach. It could strand a patrol without water in territory where no help was coming. It could, through nothing more dramatic than a few degrees of navigational error compounded over 200 miles, cause a patrol to simply vanish, never finding the fuel dump or rendezvous point it depended on to survive the trip home. Every single technique described here, the stripped-down trucks, the sun compass, the water conservation, the terrain-reading driving skill, existed because the alternative to mastering them wasn't failure. It was death, in a landscape with no one nearby to notice. What British forces in North Africa ultimately built, across the years of the Desert Campaign, was not simply a raiding capability. It was an entirely new body of practical knowledge about how human beings and machines could survive and operate in terrain that only a decade earlier had been considered by essentially everyone in a position of military authority to be genuinely impassable. That knowledge, carried in the specific skill of individual navigators, drivers, and mechanics, rather than in any manual or piece of equipment on its own, is what actually turned Devil Country into a road, one the enemy never thought to guard, because no one had ever believed anyone could travel it at all.